right now, because I've done this work, I can feel the back of my arm on the chair, and I can feel my leg crossed over my other leg, and I can feel the temperature, and I'm aware of that at any given moment. Before doing that work, we could be in an igloo right now, and I would hardly even notice. My senses were so dulled.
I'm Eric Newton, and this is Together, the podcast where we explore the truth about human relationships. As a divorce lawyer, I saw thousands of couples break up firsthand. These days, I'm not so interested in breaking couples up, nor in keeping them together. I'm interested in what our relationships can teach us about ourselves and the world that we live in. So on this show, we have honest conversations with real people about real relationships. I met our guest today, Iris McAlpin, at a dinner event recently. It was a large group. It was a discussion-oriented dinner, and Iris stood in front of the room and she spoke so eloquently about the intersection of mindfulness and our collective responses to sexual misconduct that, well, I had to ask her onto the show, so here she is. Now, Iris is the founder of a program called Freedom from Food Addiction, an online course for women. She's a coach, she's a writer, she's a mental health advocate, and she hosts a podcast of her own called Pure Curiosity, which is a delight of a show, and you should definitely listen to it. But critical to our conversation, she is also the survivor of multiple experiences of sexual abuse. And having recovered from those, she has some unique ideas about how we all should be relating to the perpetrators of these kinds of abuses. She also has quite a bit to say about the healing process that's available to all of us after abuse. And so before I give too much away, let's go to our interview with Iris McAlpin. So we decided that we'd talk about sort of the Me Too movement, which is really reshaping our culture right now in an important way. And you sort of prefaced it by saying that you have personal experiences and insights that come from working with women, but men too, I think, who are, in this process themselves. So I guess we should start with your personal experience.
Yeah, so it's sort of funny because I feel like in order to talk about a lot of these topics in a more complex way, I sort of have to qualify what I'm talking about with my own experience, because if I start to get into some of these topics, people will say, oh, that's victim blaming, or you're a male apologist or something like that. And if I don't say this first, it kind of goes there, which is maybe a shame. Maybe that's just the way it is. But so I was first sexually assaulted when I was 7, and as is really common, I didn't know this until much later, but there's something called re-victimization, where somebody who has been targeted at an early age often ends up having similar experiences throughout their life. So something happened to me very similar when I was 13, and then 16, and then 21, 24, and I think there were some smaller incidences in the middle, but so yeah, I have a long and varied past. I can get into more detail if you want, but
and each of those, I'm interested in this concept of re-victimization. So each of those moments, those experiences, were with different men.
Yes.
And I'm assuming men.
Yes.
But what's the other term for perpetrators?
Yeah, perpetrators are predators, I guess, especially when you're dealing with small children. That tends to be a common term.
Yeah. So, but the concept of re-victimization, you're right, that's a tricky phrasing. I guess if you're not speaking about it from a purely academic perspective, it sounds like maybe you're almost blaming the victim.
Yeah, and that is where it gets really tricky. And I think something that it's really important to discuss, and I certainly understand the impact of that. I went on to deal with severe depression for most of my life. I had an eating disorder for about 13 years as well. And there were other factors. It's always a complex system, but, what can end up happening, it's in psychology, the term is repetition compulsion. And Freud was the one who talked about this. His theory was that people were trying to gain a certain amount of mastery over the experience, putting themselves in similar situations to try to flip the script and make it go differently. But it turns out, there have been a lot of studies on this, it turns out it doesn't usually happen that way. People usually end up reliving the same thing over and over again and becoming more traumatized and more likely to find themselves in similar situations. And sort of, Eastern approaches have one theory of that it's about energy and vibes and things that you're putting out. And psychologists have a different explanation. But, in my case, I'll just speak to my own experience. I drank heavily in my teen years. And of course, that's not condoning the behavior of the other people, but I was deeply upset and I wasn't dealing with the issue. And so for me, drinking was a way to self-medicate. And then I found myself in some very compromising situations.
Because you were drunk.
Because I was drunk, because I was depressed, And this happens a lot. And people say, if you mention that, like, well, why were you drinking so much? If the question is coming from a shaming place, like, well, why were you drinking so much? That is victim blaming. But if you ask, why were you? What's going on? Like, why are you engaging in self-destructive behavior as a place of inquiry rather than condemnation?
Yeah.
So I think, these kinds of things can happen a lot. And I think a lot of women have experienced these things multiple times.
Right. And it almost doesn't matter. The why almost doesn't really matter here, does it? You were saying the Eastern philosophy has one perspective and Western psychology another, and there are branches within each of those, I'm sure. But what's important is that it is occurring.
Yeah.
And so what do you do then?
Yeah. Well, and then I think, it's important to be able to have the space to ask those questions from a place of trying to understand. Because if, let's say I was not vocal about this at all while this was happening, so nobody really had the opportunity to help me that much with this. But had somebody known what was going on, had somebody asked me, not from like a place of censure, but, why are you drinking so much? That could have been a place to explore so that I could actually deal with it at the root rather than trying to cover it up with something else. And so I think if, there are people out there that people aren't asking those questions, trying to get to the root of it. And some people end up, again, it's definitely not their fault, but they do end up in these situations over and over again.
Yeah. Yeah. So re-victimization is a pattern that can be observed.
Yes. It's very, very common. I forget the stats, but you can look it up. It's pretty well documented.
And the ancillary behaviors or experiences are also patterns that can be observed. Mm-hmm. All in service not of pointing fingers, but at understanding.
Yes.
The root cause, but really understanding. To the extent that a root cause understanding is possible.
Sure.
But that further inquiry is the point.
Yes.
And from there, in theory, what arises from that?
Well, we could talk about that for a really long time, but I think a lot of what it comes down to is developing intervention strategies. And part of the biggest problem is disclosure. And so, when I was 7, I was molested by a family friend, but, I didn't tell anybody about it until I was 30, I think. And so...
at which point this re-victimization process had manifested 6 times?
Yeah. I mean, and there were other incidences too of getting, groped at concerts and stuff like that. But in terms of what I would really consider sexual assault, or even rape in some cases, that happened multiple times afterward.
we talk, and appropriately so, about the suffering of the victims at this phase in our cultural dialogue around this, and that's definitely the right emphasis to have on the conversation. Also, outing of perpetrators, if they're not going to out themselves, is also a critical thing to do right now. And that said, given that it's so pervasive, a portion of these perpetrators have to be suffering themselves for what they did.
Oh my gosh, yeah.
It's been said that PTSD is often experienced not because of what was done to these people in war zones, but what they remember that they did to others.
Very, very true.
So what is the approach to take with this seemingly huge number of men who've done things that they likely regret?
Yeah, so we can address that at a couple of different levels. I mean, culturally, we're seeing this really strong feminist movement happening, which I'm really grateful for. And I also feel sometimes in that forward momentum in the feminist movement, men are getting sort of kicked to the curb a little bit. And we're seeing this culturally. I mean, men, or boys, I should say, are 30% more likely to drop out of school. Women are outperforming men at every level of education, from pre-K to like graduate level. And I think men or boys are 5 times more likely to be prescribed ADHD medication. Men are watching, tons of porn and spending thousands and thousands of hours in isolation playing video games. I mean, these are all factors, I think, that are, I hate to say it, but breeding grounds for more of what we've been dealing with. And I think if we don't look at that, Philip Zimbardo talks about this a lot. He wrote a book called Man Interrupted that really delves into this if you're more interested. But, I think if we don't look at how do we create a healthier society for all people of every gender, then we're going to keep having some of these problems. So I think addressing that on a more large scale perspective is important. I think more on the individual level, I think people really need to start doing their own inner work. And that can look a lot of different ways. But if you've been hurt, and I think most humans fall into that category of people who've been hurt. So I really think learning how you operate, understanding your emotions, cultivating some facility with that emotional intelligence is generally the label that we put on that. And really understanding your triggers and your impulses and your drives and your motivations and all of that is critical for everyone.
Those two levels are both fascinating. I'm curious what you think the cultural prescriptions are, what we should do on that level. But what has more charge is what about these individual men who've done things?
Sure.
Now, because specifically you've interacted with several of them.
Yeah.
It's really, more than your fair share, but also you have a lot of data points here. My guess is what you want for the men who've acted inappropriately with you is for their healing.
Yeah, absolutely.
And you want them to face what they have done and where it came from head on, which is a painful and scary process. But you want them to do it and to come out the other side deeper, richer, more developed souls. And please fill out anything I missed there. But
no, that captures it really well.
But how do you want your broader kind of sisterhood, the broader public of women out there then to think about these men? Like, what if Bill, some specific guy named Bill did a thing to you, and then all of the women knew that he had done that thing to you, but that he had also gone through a healing process? How would you want them to treat him?
Well, there's no one answer to that, because it depends on, is Bill remorseful? Is he likely to do it again? Has he really gotten to a place where he's healed? Is he helping other young men process and prevent, like Shaka Senghor talks about this a lot, sort of acknowledge, apologize, and atone. And part of atonement is working in your community, going back and making sure that people learn from your hard lessons. And so, if Bill's going and doing all of that, then I think we should get behind him and support him in preventing this from happening. And if he's victim blaming and turning it around on other people, then that's a completely different issue. So I think it really depends on where that person is. But I think one thing that does concern me a little bit, and Megan talked about this quite a bit, it would have been really easy to just throw this person under the bus, and I think a lot of people would have jumped on sort of the pile-on of oh yeah, he's a bad person. Instead, she chose to approach him one-on-one, and because he was remorseful and apologetic, she didn't feel the need to broadcast to everybody that he was this monstrous person who hurt her. And so I think my personal approach is to address it with the person first. And if they are surprised or apologetic, then, work through that with them. If they're not, and you feel like they're just as likely to go hurt someone else, then that's a really good time to talk publicly about it.
How do you feel about men in general? I mean, how do you? Oh, yeah. Again,
there's, in general, I feel right now like men are, I know people talk about male privilege and all this kind of stuff. I question that right now. Again, based on some of those statistics that we're seeing, men are being outperformed by women in many, many categories, and increasingly isolated. And you watch, all you have to do is turn on TV for 20 minutes, and most commercials, men are being diminished in some form or fashion. Like the wife is oh, my husband's so stupid, and it's funny and we laugh. And that's sort of this overarching theme, men are pigs, men are stupid. And I hear it all the time, when I'm just out with people, girls or women, just doing subtle little pokes into their man's manhood. And it has an impact. And because women have been oppressed for so long, the pendulum has swung in the other direction, where now it's okay to belittle men and emasculate them publicly, and that's perfectly acceptable. And I don't think it's a cause and effect. I don't think that's why we're seeing this phenomenon happening. I think it's been going on forever, but I don't think it helps. And I think honestly, right now, I feel like empowering men needs to be a bigger part of the cultural conversation at large.
It's going to be a hard one to market.
I know. That's why I don't talk about it that much.
All right, it's time to take a break so that I can thank today's sponsors for the show, Zola.com. That's Zola.com. Zola is the wedding company that will do anything for love. They're reinventing the wedding planning and registry experience to make the happiest moments in our couples' lives even happier. Okay, now that's their tagline, but the truth is, Zola is actually pretty great. Now, you may not know this, but I go to a lot of weddings. I don't think it has to do with this show. It's just a fact of life. But Aubrey and I have been to something like 25 weddings in the last 2 years. It's ridiculous. But I'll tell you, whenever the bride and groom set up a Zola website, it's always the easiest to navigate. And the reason is because they've figured out how to combine all of the wedding information that you need with the registry. It all goes together in one nice, tidy package. It's very easy to navigate. They've got an iPhone app so that couples can manage their registries on the go. They offer price matching and free shipping. They've got a host of wedding planning tools. It's really pretty great. So to sign up with Zola and receive a $50 credit towards your registry, go to zola.com/couples. That's ZOLA.com/couples. Now back to the show. It seems to me that if the message could get across that we can have the strength and courage to face the truth head on, then all of us who are embedded in this edifice on every level would be able and willing to deconstruct it without a hammer. But I don't know how to get that message out. Do you?
Not exactly, except this is very much a lead by example situation, I think. And I've had to, because of some of the things that have happened to me, I had to look at myself from a critical, analytical standpoint pretty early in life. And I think on some level, maybe I was sort of primed to look at things that way anyway, but I've looked at some really dark shit, and I've had to, I've gone to some really dark places. I was very suicidal when I was in my late teens, and I was fortunate to be born into a family where we were able to afford treatment, and I was seeing therapists, and they were of varying degrees of helpfulness, but I was at least getting some help. And so it's not like I was doing this completely alone, but I just have a hard time believing that if I was able to go and look at those dark corners and face truth and all of those different layers that I had to peel back, that everyone else isn't equally capable of that. I can't wrap my head around that I'm just somehow uniquely special in my ability to look at these dark emotions.
You're not Buddha, is what, none of us is a superhero.
Right.
We're all ordinary people capable of the extraordinary acts.
Exactly. And so I talk about that very publicly, and just my being willing to do the work. Sometimes it's really exciting and interesting. Sometimes it's fucking terrifying. Sometimes it is gutting and you are just crying on the floor in a ball. Sometimes you are laughing hysterically. And maybe that's the thing that's weird about me, is that I love that, in the sense that, we have this one life that we're aware of, and why not experience every facet of our emotional range?
Yeah.
And yeah, it can be scary at times, but if we can look at that and just know, and have people out there saying, I've been there too, it's okay, you're not going to die, just, go there and you can come back. But yeah, I think if that becomes normalized, then maybe people won't be so afraid of it. I went through a period of time a couple years ago where I did have sort of a re-traumatization type scenario where I was dealing with PTSD again, sort of out of left field, and just related to sexual trauma. And I was really terrified. I was like going into this landscape that was unfamiliar to me, and because I went and did, it's called SomaticExperiencing, and with trauma, it gets stored into our bodies a lot, and for me that was like this incredibly scary feeling of getting reconnected to my body. And especially, this is something I deal with a lot with my clients. I work with women with eating disorders. We basically live from the neck up. And when I started doing the work to reconnect my mind and body, I thought I was going to get blown over.
Do you mean that you live from the neck up, in that you've shut off awareness of the body completely, on many levels?
Yeah.
And so reconnecting your consciousness to the rest of yourself.
Yeah. So like right now, because I've done this work, I can feel the back of my arm on the chair, and I can feel my leg crossed over my other leg, and I can feel the temperature, and I'm aware of that at any given moment. Before doing that work, we could be in an igloo right now and I would hardly even notice. I was just, my senses were so dulled. And that happened, in trauma, when something happens, your mind sort of advantageously decides that your body is not a safe place to be hanging out and severs that connection. And so all kinds of stuff gets stored in, there's that saying, your issues are in your tissues. Things get stored into our bodies. And when that reconnection starts happening and you realize all the stuff that you have stored in there that doesn't necessarily, I'm a very verbal person. I didn't have words for it. And that scared the shit out of me. And so I think the reason I bring that up is, if you're looking into the future, looking at some of the healing work you might have to do and you're really scared, I think, first of all, just knowing that, A, you can face it, you're not going to die, but also doing some mind-body work. A lot of people find yoga really helpful for this. Reading about it, just to normalize it, is important. But, and also getting some help with that so that you're not dealing with it completely by yourself is something really critical.
Yeah, getting support. Yeah, can't be the need, the necessity can't be understated.
If I'm going in to do some deep healing work, and whatever that looks like, if I'm just doing that in a vacuum and I don't tell anybody that I'm doing it, if I'm like in a room by myself, that feels much scarier than if I, call a fellow coach or somebody and tell them, hey, I'm working on this. I'm going to be sitting down to do some writing. Some stuff might come up. I just want to tell you that so that if it gets weird, I can call you. And I almost never need to, but just having that, knowing that there's somebody out there who has my back if I need it, makes it possible to go deeper. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it really does. And it also seems like, different people provide different kinds of tools in a way. I've noticed in my life sometimes one-on-one talk therapy is what I need.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's useless. Sometimes
Totally.
sometimes I need a coach.
Yeah.
Which is a distinct thing from a therapist.
Very.
And I more and more people are becoming aware of that, but it is a very distinct thing.
Yeah.
Sometimes I need a group setting. Like sometimes I need a seminar or a workshop, or sometimes I just need my fucking mom.
Yeah.
Yeah. And a lot of times I don't know which it is until I start trying. But I need that diverse tool bag. Sometimes I need to write. Sometimes I need to do use my own set of tools that I've created for other people, whatever. But you need that diverse tool bag, and that comes with community.
You don't need to just settle with one thing. You can try group therapy for a while. You can go see a one-on-one therapist. You can work with a coach. You can read a bunch of books. I think some people get stuck in, okay, I have to go to therapy for X amount of time, and that's the one thing that I'm doing. And I recently went and got a therapist again for the first time in years. I've been working with coaches for years, and it just, for whatever reason, I had this intuition it'd be good for me, and it's been great. But I'm not always seeing a therapist. I don't always have a coach, but I'm always doing something.
Yeah.
I just think, especially if you're working with people who are dealing with some heavy stuff, it's important to continue your own work so that you're a clear vessel to be there for others.
Yeah.
And, but yeah, I just try it all, try everything and, revisit things as necessary.
But there is probably a first step at least, right? Like get safe or something.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, get safe is definitely number one. And if you're in an abusive relationship, that can be very complicated in terms of getting out of it. And there are, hotlines and things that you can call upon for support, women's shelters, that kind of thing. So yeah, absolutely getting safe. And, I really don't, I'm sure there are people, you could go online and find some step-by-step thing that's not, I don't really think about it in that way. Maybe there is some sort of formula for it, but, my path was not linear by any stretch of the imagination. And I really am a firm believer that things come up when they need to and not a moment sooner. And, maybe my life would have gone more smoothly if I had dealt with it at a younger age and I had told people. But I also got a lot of really valuable lessons from the suffering that I went through and having to go through that sort of dark period. I'm ultimately very grateful for that, and I wouldn't wish it on anyone else. But, I think I would say when you're ready, talk to somebody about it. I would say a little sooner than you're ready, talk to somebody about it. Like, it's still uncomfortable, but you can. And, acknowledging it. And of course, I would say if you want to step by step, it's, before you can acknowledge it to somebody else, you have to acknowledge it to yourself. And that, I'd say for a lot of us, is the hardest part. And it's hard to say, I hate the word victim. Even still, I hate that word. But it's difficult to acknowledge, like, wow, I was victimized by this person. Because you don't want to be that person. It feels
We need a
weak.
new term.
Yeah, we really do.
Because victimization really does have this connotation of weakness.
I hate that.
I was transgressed upon.
Yeah.
It's a little too wordy.
Yeah, it's hard. Yeah. I'm not good at naming things, but we need a better term for that, because there's so much baggage that comes with that word. And I personally don't use that word to describe myself. I don't feel like a victim on any level, but that is the term that is, used. And it's really difficult to think about yourself in those terms. Like your last guest talked about this as well. She had to relate to herself as somebody who had been raped.
Yeah.
And that's a weird thing to wrap your head around.
Yeah.
And so I think getting to a place where you don't forget labels. When you can just acknowledge, this happened to me, it made me feel really bad, whatever that looks like. It made me angry, it made me depressed, it made me whatever. Just acknowledging, this happened, it made me feel this way, and I'm not okay with that. That's step one. And then, disclosing to others, I chose to be very public about, sharing what's happened for me, but maybe you don't have to tell everyone right away. Maybe you start doing some research on your own. Then maybe reach out to a friend or a therapist or somebody. I think holding it alone forever is a lot to deal with. But, being vulnerable and getting it off your chest, I think is a pretty critical step as well. And then it's going to look a lot of different ways. And for me, there were times where, I was really angry. There were times I was really sad, resentful, everything that you could think of, I felt about it, and none of it was permanent. And I think part of what made it not be permanent, because for some people do get stuck there. So I don't want to just say, take it for granted that it's all going to work out no matter what. I think for me, what helped me not get stuck was just continuing the work, even when it felt like I was getting worse. I think you mentioned that. Sometimes it looks on the surface like things are getting worse, but you're actually getting better. But yeah, just staying on that path and trying new things. If you're feeling stuck with one technique, try another one. And yeah, I guess the reason why I'm wary of any sort of system or step process, it's just everyone has their own journey. And as long as you keep trying new things, I don't really think you can fail.
That's interesting. Yeah, as long as you stay on the ride, in a sense.
If you get off the ride in the middle of the ride, that doesn't usually turn out well. So that's what I would say. That's the one thing I would say, like, don't do that. But everything else is fair game.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's our adventure to have.
Exactly.
These conversations around the Me Too movement that I've been posting recently are something of a departure from our normal programming, in that we're not talking about couples or their specific relationships. That said, the broader dialogue that's happening in this space is so critical to our growth as a society and to the flourishing of our romantic relationships that I say it simply can't be ignored. There has to be parity in our relationships for them to survive, and that means transparency, and it means truth-telling, even when that process is painful. Now, what inspires me so much about Iris is her ability to make that truth-telling process constructive. It takes great strength to do that rather than to make it destructive. And Iris's consistent message is that if she can do it, we can all do it. Thank you for that, Iris. If you'd like to learn more about Iris and her programs, you can find her website at irismcalpin.com. That's irismcalpin.com, and I'll put links to that in our show notes. Don't forget about our sponsors for today's show, Zola.com. For a $50 credit towards your registry, go to zola.com/couples. If you liked what you heard today, please do subscribe. It's not free to produce this show, and I would absolutely love your support. You can support us by going to our website and clicking on the Support Us links, or going directly to Patreon. That's patreon.com/together. If you've got questions or comments, or if you'd just like to connect, you can find us on social media. Our Facebook page is facebook.com/togethershow. Twitter and Instagram are both at @together_show. And you can always email me at host@together.guide. The music in today's episode is by blue.sessions, and you can find them at sessions.blue. That's all for today, folks. Talk to you next time.